The iron of the Sterling estate gates was freezing. It was the kind of cold that did not simply rest on the skin, but sank past the flesh, settling deep into the bone. Evelyn Sterling stood on the wrong side of the wrought iron bars, the snow falling in slow, indifferent sheets around her. Her faded gray wool dress, practical for the harsh winters of the country, but never intended for standing motionless in a storm, was already soaked at the hem. The damp fabric clung heavily to her ankles, dragging her down like an anchor. Beside her, on the pristine white gravel that led to the county road, sat a single leather suitcase. It held precisely 20 years of her life. Evelyn did not cry. Her hazel eyes, usually wide and tired from carrying the invisible weight of the crumbling estate, were dry. The mascara she had applied that morning before she knew her marriage was ending was lightly smudged beneath her lower lashes, the only evidence that a quiet, desperate tear had fallen when she signed the divorce papers an hour ago. She raised her right hand. Her fingers were numb, trembling slightly, but she gripped her left wrist with punishing force to stop the shaking. She refused to let them see her tremble. Through the intricate black ironwork of the gates, 50 yards up the grand sweeping driveway, the Sterling mansion glowed. Every window in the east wing was ablaze with warm, golden light. It looked like a fortress of untouched wealth, a masterpiece of classic, high society architecture. But Evelyn knew the truth. She knew the plaster was cracking behind the velvet drapes in the drawing room. She knew the roof in the west wing leaked during heavy rains. And she knew that the man standing behind the tall glass of the library window was drowning in a sea of debt he was too arrogant to acknowledge. He was not looking at Evelyn. He was looking past her down the county road, likely calculating how quickly the carriage would arrive to remove the inconvenient stain of his first wife from his newly polished life. Then a second figure joined him at the window, Vivienne Vance. Even through the falling snow and the thick glass, the brutal emerald green of Vivienne's silk dress assaulted the eyes. It was a summer gown entirely unsuited for the brutal winter of the estate, but Vivienne wore it like a weapon. She had the narrow, highly structured face of a woman who spent more time curating her angles than her character. Her bleached blonde hair was styled in rigid, perfect curls that did not move as she leaned into Arthur's side. Evelyn watched as Vivienne raised a hand to her throat, laughing at something Arthur said. The light caught the jewelry resting against Vivienne's collarbone. Evelyn's breath hitched a sharp intake of freezing air that burned her lungs. It was a pearl necklace. Her grandmother's pearl necklace. The one Evelyn had left on the mahogany dresser in the master bedroom, believing that some lines of basic human decency would not be crossed. She was wrong. Vivienne had not just taken Evelyn's husband her home and her title. She had walked into her bedroom and taken her history. Evelyn looked down at her own hand. Her right fist was clenched so tightly her knuckles were stark white against the gray winter light. Slowly, painfully, she uncurled her frozen fingers. Resting in the center of her palm was a heavy, rusted iron key. It was the master key to the estate's outer gates. Arthur had demanded she leave her house keys on the desk along with the signed divorce papers, and she had obeyed. But this old rusted key, forgotten by the staff and ignored by Arthur, had been sitting in the pocket of her wool coat for 3 years. The jagged teeth of the iron dug deeply into her flesh, leaving a crescent-shaped red mark on her pale skin. The ghost. After 20 years of maintaining the ledgers, firing the corrupt managers, selling her own dowry to pay for the estate's heating oil, she had been reduced to a ghost. Evelyn closed her hand around the rusted key again. The physical pain in her palm anchored her. It stopped the suffocating panic from rising in her throat. She looked back at the glowing window. Vivienne was holding a leather folder now, the infamous trust fund letter she had paraded in front of Arthur's lawyers. Evelyn had only caught a glimpse of it on the desk, but she had noticed the font. It was the same standard typeface used by cheap, rapid printing legal mills in Manhattan, not the bespoke embossed stationery of old money wealth. But Arthur, blinded by desperation and the allure of a younger, sharper woman, had seen only what he wanted to see. He believed Vivienne was his salvation. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to his sinking ship to a woman who was already drowning. The sound of approaching hooves and wooden wheels broke the heavy silence of the snow. The hired carriage, a dull black box with peeling paint, pulled to a halt on the gravel road behind her. The driver, a young boy wrapped in a thick scarf, looked at Evelyn with a mixture of pity and discomfort. "Ma'am," he called out softly, hesitant to interrupt the stark tragedy of the scene. "To the village." Evelyn did not answer immediately. She took one final look at the Sterling estate. She looked at the towering stone chimneys, the intricate ironwork of the gates, the sprawling snow-covered lawns that she had fought to keep out of the hands of creditors for 2 decades. Then she looked at the red mark on her palm. "Real capital," Arthur had said. Evelyn slipped the rusted key deep into the pocket of her heavy gray coat. She reached down her posture, straightening slightly, the frail, obedient curve of her spine aligning into something rigid and unfamiliar. She picked up her single leather suitcase. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice completely devoid of tears, carrying the crisp, devastating chill of the winter air. "To the village. I have a long journey to London tomorrow." She stepped into the carriage, leaving the gates behind. She did not look back. Let Arthur have his whiskey and his fake heiress. Let them enjoy the warmth of the fire. By winter's end, that fire would belong to her. The room at the village inn was not designed for comfort. It was a narrow, drafty box sitting above the local tavern, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old dust, and cheap lye soap. The single window rattled furiously against the winter wind, letting in thin blades of freezing air that cut across the bare floorboards. Evelyn stood in the center of the room. She did not move to light the small oil lamp on the bedside table. She simply stood in the dim, slate-gray light filtering through the frosted glass, listening to the floorboards creak under her own weight. Her single leather suitcase sat by the door looking pathetic and small. 20 years of marriage reduced to whatever could be packed in 10 minutes under the watchful, mocking eyes of Vivienne Vance. The cold was absolute now. The damp hem of her faded gray wool dress, soaked from the snow at the estate gates, clung to her calves like a frozen shroud. Her toes were numb inside her leather boots. Slowly, with stiff and trembling fingers, Evelyn reached up and unfastened the top buttons of the dress. The fabric felt heavy, thick with the weight of her own exhaustion. She peeled it off, shivering violently as the freezing air hit her pale skin and draped the wet wool over the back of a wooden chair. It looked exactly like what it was, the discarded uniform of an obedient, broken wife. Evelyn wrapped herself in a thin, scratchy wool blanket from the narrow bed and sat on the edge of the mattress. The mattress was hard, unforgiving. There was no roaring fire here. There was no crystal glass of whiskey. There was only the sound of the wind and the crushing, suffocating silence of a woman who had just lost everything she had spent her adult life trying to build. She had been his shield. And the moment he found a woman who handed him a shiny, forged trust fund letter, he had thrown his shield into the snow. Evelyn pressed her fingernails into her own wrists, gripping her arms until the pain sharpened her focus. "Do not cry," she commanded herself. "Tears are a currency that buys nothing." She uncurled her right hand. The heavy, rusted iron key she had carried from the gates was still resting in her palm. The metal had warmed to the temperature of her skin. Deep in the center of her hand, the jagged teeth of the key had left a stark, angry red crescent mark. It looked like a brand, a permanent reminder of what loyalty had earned her. She stared at the key, and as she did, the frantic, shivering panic in her chest began to slow. The rhythm of her heart changed. The chaotic noise of betrayal faded, replaced by a devastating, clinical silence. Arthur had always been a man who looked at the surface of things. He looked at Vivienne's emerald silk dress and saw a fortune. He looked at Evelyn's faded gray wool and saw a liability. He had assumed with the arrogant blindness of a man born to a title that because Evelyn lived modestly she had nothing. When they married, he knew she came from old blood, but because her family did not throw lavish galas or buy new carriages every season, he assumed her family's coffers were as dusty as their history. He was wrong. Evelyn's grandfather had been a man of quiet, terrifying competence. He had despised the loud, flashy wealth of the new century. Wealth is not what you wear. Evelyn, he had told her once in the quiet, leather-scented sanctuary of his London study. Wealth is what you control. The man who owns the building is always quieter than the man renting the penthouse. Before he died, he had established a blind trust in Evelyn's maiden name. It was managed by a discreet legal firm in London designed to compound quietly, safely, far away from the grasping hands of aristocratic husbands. Evelyn had never touched it. Over the last 20 years, as Arthur's debts mounted and the Sterling estate teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, she had been tempted. She could have liquidated her grandfather's assets to save her husband, but a quiet instinct, a voice of preservation she had ignored in every other aspect of her marriage, had stopped her. She had decided early on that she would save the estate with the estate's own revenues through hard work and discipline. She would not bleed her ancestry to fund Arthur's vanity. Arthur did not know the trust existed. Vivienne did not know the trust existed. To them, Evelyn was just a discarded, penniless ex-wife, freezing in a village motel. They had no idea that the woman they had just thrown out was legally capable of buying the entire county. Evelyn touched the red mark on her palm. Her hazel eyes, previously wide and tired, narrowed. The warmth of the tears that had threatened to fall evaporated, freezing into something hard and untouchable. The shivering stopped entirely. Arthur's wealth was an illusion. The Sterling estate was mortgaged to the hilt. The agricultural loans, the maintenance debts, the credit lines at the local banks, they were all bundled and held by a financial syndicate in London. Arthur only owned the title. The banks owned the dirt. And because Arthur was desperate, he was relying on Vivienne's trust fund to pay off the ballooning interest before the winter ended. But Evelyn knew Vivienne's trust fund was a lie. She had seen the cheap typeface. She had seen the desperate, calculated way Vivienne looked at the silver in the dining room. When Vivienne's money failed to materialize, Arthur would default. And when a duke defaults, the bank forecloses. Evelyn stood up from the bed. Her posture, which had been curved with exhaustion and grief for a decade, straightened. Her spine locked into a rigid, perfect line. The fragile, soft oval of her face seemed to sharpen the gentle jawline setting like carved marble. The woman who had quietly accepted a single suitcase and a signed divorce paper was dead. She walked over to the cheap wooden desk in the corner of the room. She opened her suitcase and withdrew a single sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery and a fountain pen. She sat down. She did not hesitate. The nib of the pen scratched against the paper with quiet, deadly authority. She wrote a letter to Mr. Carlyle, the senior partner managing her grandfather's trust in London. She authorized the immediate unsealing of her accounts. She issued a single explicit directive. Acquire the debt portfolio of the Sterling estate, all of it. Pay the premium if necessary. Buy the mortgages, the agricultural liens, the personal credit lines. Do it quietly through a shell corporation. I want the paper. I want the deeds. She signed her maiden name with a steady hand. Evelyn folded the letter, sealing it in an envelope. She looked out the rattling window toward the dark horizon where the Sterling estate sat in the snow. Arthur thought he had kicked her out of his house. He was about to discover that he was living in hers. London was a city that respected silence, provided that the silence was expensive. She walked into the mahogany-paneled offices of Carlyle and Sons with the quiet authority of a woman who owned the ground beneath her boots. Mr. Carlyle, a man who had spent 40 years managing the invisible fortunes of the country's oldest families, stood immediately when she entered. He did not offer condolences on her divorce. He understood that Evelyn had not come for pity, she had come for paper. The directives in your letter were explicit, madam, Mr. Carlyle said, guiding her to a leather wingback chair. He opened a thick leather portfolio on his desk. We moved quickly. The financial syndicate holding the Sterling estate's debt was eager to liquidate. Arthur Sterling is by all standard metrics a catastrophic liability. The agricultural loans have not been serviced in 8 months. The mortgages on the West Wing are dangerously close to default. "Did you acquire all of it?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was steady, lacking any trace of the exhaustion that had plagued her for the last decade. Every single note, Carlyle confirmed, sliding a dense stack of legal documents across the polished desk. The debt was purchased at a slight premium to ensure discretion using a shell corporation named Winter Holdings. As of this morning, Arthur Sterling owes his entire existence to that entity. The banks no longer hold the deeds to the estate, the land, or the manor. Evelyn reached out with her right hand. The red crescent-shaped mark from the rusted iron key was still visible on her palm, a faint but undeniable scar of her eviction. She rested her hand on the documents. "And the foreclosure triggers?" she asked softly. "Operative," Carlyle said. "The grace period on the primary mortgage expired yesterday. You have the legal right to call in the entirety of the debt immediately. If he cannot produce the capital within 24 hours of the notice, the estate is yours to seize. Will you send the bailiffs?" Evelyn looked at the documents, her expression completely unreadable. "No, I will not send bailiffs. Arthur is hosting a winter gala next week to introduce his new bride to the county. I will deliver the notice myself." Meanwhile, 200 miles north, the Sterling estate was bleeding money it did not have. The winter storm had passed, leaving the sprawling grounds buried under 2 feet of pristine, glittering snow. Inside the Grand Manor, the atmosphere was a frantic, brittle performance of wealth. Arthur Sterling stood in the drawing room, his brow heavy with irritation, flicking open his gold pocket watch. It was still exactly 3 minutes late. White orchids. Vivian Vance snapped her voice, carrying a sharp nasal edge that echoed off the cracking plaster of the ceiling. She paced in front of the massive fireplace, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the trembling estate manager. "I do not care if they have to be shipped from a greenhouse in Paris. The winter gala will have white orchids." She had abandoned the emerald silk dress for an oversized cashmere sweater charged entirely to Arthur's dwindling local credit. Her bleached blonde curls were pinned back, highlighting the sharp, predatory angle of her cheekbones. Around her neck, Evelyn's grandmother's pearl necklace rested against her skin, a stolen trophy she wore like armor. "Madam," the estate manager murmured, looking nervously toward Arthur. "The florists in the county are demanding upfront payment. The accounts are strained." "Then strain them further," Vivian hissed. She turned to Arthur, her pale green eyes wide with manufactured distress. "Arthur, darling, we cannot invite the entire county elite and have the manor looking like a neglected barn. It reflects poorly on the Duke." Arthur closed his pocket watch with a sharp click. "Procure the orchid's hues. Put it on the secondary credit line." Hughes hesitated, clutching a leather-bound ledger to his chest. "Your Grace, I must inform you, the secondary line was frozen this morning, and we received a notice from the banking syndicate. They no longer hold your mortgages." Arthur froze. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his steely blue eyes before his practiced arrogance smothered it. "What do you mean they no longer hold it? Who does?" "A private entity," Hughes whispered. "Winter Holdings. They bought the entirety of the estate's debt yesterday." Vivian stopped pacing. The name meant nothing to her, but the word debt was a trigger that made her breath catch. Arthur waved his hand dismissively, though his jaw was locked tight. "Foreign investors, no doubt. It makes no difference. It is simply paper shuffling. Vivian's trust fund matures in 4 days, right before the gala. Once the New York capital is transferred, we will clear the immediate arrears and restructure the rest," dismissed Hughes. The manager bowed and hurried out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the drawing room. Arthur poured himself a large glass of whiskey, his hand trembling, just enough to make the crystal clink against the decanter. He looked at Vivienne. "The transfer will be on time, won't it, my love?" Vivienne forced a bright, flawless smile. "Of course, Arthur. The The lawyers in Manhattan are just dealing with the final tax clearances. It is a massive fortune. These things take a moment. Good, Arthur muttered, drinking the whiskey in one swallow. Good. He walked out of the room, desperate for the distraction of his hunting dogs. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, Vivian's smile vanished. Her face drained of color, leaving her sharp features looking skeletal and terrified. She rushed up the grand staircase to the master bedroom and locked the door. With shaking hands, she pulled a crumpled telegram from the pocket of her cashmere sweater. It had arrived that morning from New York. Creditors aware of fraud. If payment not received by Friday, will contact your husband and press charges. You have no trust fund, Vivienne. Time is up. Vivienne gripped the edge of the mahogany dresser, her breathing shallow and erratic. She touched the cold pearls at her throat. She had played the ultimate gamble, forging the legal documents to trap a wealthy British duke, assuming his estate would provide the cash she needed to pay off her massive debts in America. She did not know that Arthur was playing the exact same game. They were two parasites desperately trying to feed on a host that had already bled dry. Back in London, the fire in Mr. Carlyle's office crackled softly. The lawyer handed Evelyn a single thick envelope. It was sealed with heavy red wax stamped with the firm's insignia. Inside was the formal notice of foreclosure, legally granting Evelyn the power to seize the Sterling estate lock, stock, and barrel. Evelyn held the red-sealed envelope in her left hand. In her right, she held the rusted iron gate key. The contrast was poetic, the rusted iron of her past humiliation and the pristine, bloody red wax of her future justice. "Shall I arrange a carriage for the night of the gala, madam?" Carlyle asked respectfully. Evelyn slid the document and the key into the deep pocket of her black velvet coat. Her hazel eyes were cold bright and utterly devoid of mercy. "Yes, Mr. Carlyle." Evelyn said, her voice a quiet, devastating promise. "It is time I went home." The white orchids arrived on the morning of the winter gala, transported in a heated carriage that cost more than the estate's monthly coal budget. It was a ridiculous offensive display of forced luxury. Outside the heavy oak doors of the Sterling estate, the temperature had plummeted to a bitter, bone-chilling freeze. The snow had hardened into thick sheets of ice, turning the sweeping driveway into a treacherous sheet of white glass. As the delivery men carried the delicate tropical flowers up the stone steps, the freezing air immediately began to curl the edges of the pristine white petals. They were dying the second they touched the winter air. Arthur Sterling stood in the grand entrance hall, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the staff scramble to arrange the wilting flowers around the marble columns. He wore a heavy wool morning suit, his steely blue eyes sharp and calculating, projecting the image of a man in absolute control. But beneath the bespoke tailoring, the illusion was cracking. Hughes, the estate manager, approached Arthur with slow, hesitant steps. His face was pale, drawn with sleeplessness, and he clutched his leather-bound ledger as if it were a shield. "Your Grace." Hughes said, his voice barely rising above the chaotic rustle of the florists and maids. "Forgive the intrusion, but the caterers are refusing to unload the silver service until the balance is settled in cash. The secondary credit line is entirely dead. Furthermore, the staff, they have not received their wages for the month." Arthur's jaw tightened. He did not look at Hughes. He kept his gaze fixed on a massive arrangement of dying orchids being hoisted onto a pedestal. "Tell the caterers that the Duke of Sterling does not deal in petty cash transactions in the hallway," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They will be paid on Monday with a 10% premium for their patience. As for the staff, inform them that loyalty is expected before it is rewarded." Sir Hughes pressed his voice, trembling slightly. "The notice from Winter Holdings. The grace period for the debt restructuring has completely lapsed. If this private entity chooses to act, they could legally lock the doors of this house tonight." Arthur finally turned his head. He looked at Hughes with a gaze so steeped in generational arrogance it was almost blinding. He reached into his waistcoat, withdrew his gold pocket watch, and flicked it open. It clicked loudly in the cold hall, 3 minutes late as always. "You are a clerk, Hughes," Arthur said smoothly. "You see numbers, I see the board. Winter Holdings is a paper tiger, some faceless conglomerate hoping to intimidate an old family into a quick settlement. By tomorrow morning, Vivian's trust fund will clear. The New York capital will wash over this estate, and I will buy Winter Holdings out of my own ledgers just to watch them squirm. Now go to the kitchen and do your job, or I will ensure you never work in this county again." Hughes looked at the Duke for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the dying orchids. He looked at the peeling paint near the ceiling cornice. Then he bowed his head, closed his ledger, and walked away. He knew what Arthur refused to see. A dead man was giving orders in a graveyard. Upstairs in the master bedroom, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and rising panic. Vivienne Vance sat before the grand mahogany vanity mirror. The room was freezing. Arthur had ordered the fires in the upper rooms kept low to conserve fuel for the main ballroom, but Vivienne was sweating. A thin cold sheen of perspiration covered her forehead. She stared at her own reflection. Without the soft, forgiving light of a Manhattan cocktail lounge, the harsh winter daylight from the window exposed the sharp, desperate angles of her face. Her cheekbones looked hollow. Her pale green eyes were wide and erratic. Spread across the vanity table were 3 more telegrams, all from New York, all demanding immediate payment. Her creditors had found her. They knew the trust fund was a forgery, and they had threatened to wire Arthur's solicitors directly if she did not wire the funds by midnight. Her hands shook as she picked up a silver makeup brush. She applied a heavy layer of powder painting over the terror, turning her face into a flawless porcelain mask. Tonight, she told herself, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Tonight changes everything. Once the county sees me as the new Duchess, once Arthur's status shields me, the creditors won't dare strike. I just have to survive the gala. She reached out and picked up Evelyn's grandmother's pearl necklace. The pearls were heavy cool against her skin as she fastened them around her throat. They were the only things of genuine value she possessed. For a brief, hysterical second, she wondered how much they would fetch at a pawnbroker in London. She pushed the thought away. She was Vivienne Vance. She was about to host the social event of the season. She was untouchable. 10 miles away, driving through the silent, snow-choked country roads, a black carriage moved steadily toward the village. Inside the carriage, the air was perfectly still. Evelyn Sterling sat in the shadows, wrapped in her tailored black velvet coat. She did not feel the cold. Her internal temperature had long since dropped to match the winter storm outside. She did not carry a suitcase today. She carried only 2 things. In her right hand, resting gently on her lap, was the rusted iron gate key. The jagged metal pressed against her palm, aligning perfectly with the red, crescent-shaped scar that had healed over the last few days. The wound was closed, but the memory of it burned with a cold, clear focus. In her left hand, she held the thick envelope sealed with blood-red wax, the foreclosure notice, the absolute, undeniable legal right to evict Arthur Sterling from his own life. She looked out the frosted window. The bare skeletal branches of the winter trees whipped past the glass. She thought of Arthur standing in his tweed jacket, convinced of his own invincibility. She thought of Vivienne wearing the pearls that had rested on her grandmother's collarbone, playing the role of a wealthy savior. They threw me into the snow because they thought I was weak. Evelyn thought her hazel eyes completely dark, reflecting no light. They thought silence meant surrender. The carriage hit a bump, jostling the envelope in her hand. Evelyn smoothed her thumb over the red wax seal. She was not returning to the Sterling estate to argue. She was not returning to scream or weep or demand apologies. Emotional justice was rarely loud. The most devastating revenge was always delivered in a whisper. "Madam," the carriage driver called back through the small wooden partition. "The village inn is just ahead. Shall we wait there until the gala begins?" Evelyn straightened her spine, her posture rigid, elegant, and terrifyingly calm. "Yes," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet carriage like a diamond on glass. "We will wait until the ballroom is full. I want every single member of the county elite present when I take my house back." The grand chandelier in the Sterling Estate ballroom held exactly 400 crystal drops. When fully lit, it threw a blinding, shattered light across the room, designed to force anyone standing beneath it to look magnificent. But light, no matter how brilliant, cannot fix a cracked foundation. It only highlights the fractures. By 8 o'clock that evening, the ballroom was packed with the most powerful families in the county. The air was a suffocating mixture of roasting meats provided by caterers who had not been paid, and the heavy sweet rot of the white orchids, which were already turning brown at the edges from the drafts leaking through the tall window frames. A string quartet played a lively Viennese waltz in the corner, their bows moving in frantic unison. But beneath the music, the room possessed the specific dangerous energy of a shark tank. Old money has a scent for desperation. The lords, ladies, and local magnates who drank Arthur's champagne smiled at him with perfect teeth, but their eyes calculated the peeling gold leaf on the ceiling cornices. They noticed that the serving staff looked exhausted and refused to meet anyone's gaze. They noticed the chill in the room, the fires burning low because the coal cellars were nearly empty. Arthur Sterling stood at the base of the grand staircase, playing the role of the invincible host. He had traded his tweed jacket for a bespoke black tuxedo, with sharp lapels standing tall, his broad shoulders squared against the unspoken rumors. His steely blue eyes scanned the room, demanding respect through sheer stubborn entitlement. He laughed loudly at a joke made by a local magistrate, a booming, hollow sound that echoed off the marble floor. He reached into his waistcoat, withdrew the gold pocket watch, and flicked it open. 3 minutes late, he snapped it shut. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had ordained. Standing a few feet away, Vivian Vance was fighting a losing battle against her own nervous system. She wore a custom ice-white silk gown that hugged her model-thin frame, intending to look like a winter queen. Her bleached blonde hair was pinned up in a rigid cascade of perfect curls. At her throat, Evelyn's grandmother's pearls gleamed under the chandelier light. Visually, she was flawless. Emotionally, she was bleeding out. She gripped the stem of her crystal champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were translucent. Every time the heavy oak doors of the ballroom opened to admit a new guest, Vivian's breath caught in her throat. She expected bailiffs. She expected a telegram boy holding a public warrant from New York. She expected the entire room to suddenly stop and point at her, exposing the fraudulent trust fund, the massive debts, and the fact that she was currently wearing stolen jewelry to hide her own bankruptcy. "Vivienne, darling," a sharp, aristocratic voice called out. Vivienne flinched, splashing a drop of champagne onto her white silk gown. She turned to see Lady Harrington, a wealthy widow with eyes like a hawk, approaching with a predatory smile. The orchids are certainly a choice for a winter freeze. Lady Harrington purred her gaze, deliberately lingering on the brown curling edges of a nearby arrangement. "Tell me, my dear, Arthur mentioned your capital is tied up in Manhattan trusts. With the transatlantic wire delays this season, however, do you manage the transfer taxes? My own bankers in London are notoriously dreadful about it." Vivienne's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her pale green eyes darted toward Arthur, but he was busy charming a judge across the room. She was on her own. "Oh, it is simply a matter of having the right family representation." Vivienne lied, her voice tight, her American accent sounding suddenly brittle. "My lawyers handle the tedious details. We expect the final clearances by Monday." Lady Harrington's smile did not reach her eyes. "Monday? How convenient. Let us hope the local creditors share your lawyer's patience." Lady Harrington drifted away, leaving Vivienne standing in the cold draft of the window, shaking. Vivienne drained her champagne in one deeply unladylike gulp. She signaled a passing waiter for another, her hands trembling so badly the empty glass rattled against his silver tray. In the shadows near the kitchen corridor, Hughes, the estate manager, watched the display with a sickening knot in his stomach. He held his leather ledger tightly to his chest. He knew the caterers were threatening to pack up the dessert course and leave if cash was not presented before 10 o'clock. He knew the secondary credit line was dead. He knew about the notice from Winter Holdings. Arthur was dancing on the edge of a cliff blindfolded by his own ego, and he had tied the entire household to his waist. Outside, the winter night was absolutely silent. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world encased in a thick frozen crust of white ice. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. At the bottom of the long sweeping driveway, the massive wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate stood open to admit the guests' carriages. A single unmarked black carriage rolled to a quiet halt just outside the gates. Inside, Evelyn Sterling sat perfectly still. The darkness of the carriage hid her, but if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the devastating calm of her posture. She wore her tailored black velvet coat. The sharp velvet collar stood high against the bitter cold. She did not shiver. She looked through the frosted glass at the iron gates. The last time she had stood here, she had been wearing a wet-faded gray wool dress, shivering in the snow, ordered to leave with one suitcase while her husband watched from the warmth of the library. She remembered the humiliation. She remembered the sheer, suffocating weight of being erased from her own life. She slipped her bare right hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the rusted iron key. She pressed the jagged teeth against her palm, right over the healed, crescent-shaped red mark. It grounded her. It reminded her that pain was temporary, but leverage was permanent. In her left hand, she held the thick envelope sealed with blood-red wax. "We are here, madam," the driver said quietly through the partition. "Shall I pull up to the main steps?" "No," Evelyn said. Her voice was smooth, quiet, and carried the weight of an executioner's axe. "I will walk from the gates." She stepped out of the carriage. Her leather boots crunched against the frozen snow. She did not hurry. Queens do not run. She walked up the long driveway, the glowing windows of the mansion growing larger with every step. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of the string quartet playing a waltz. She could imagine Arthur smiling his empty smile. She could imagine Vivienne clinging to a stolen life. They thought they were hosting a gala. They did not realize they had simply gathered an audience for their own ruin. Evelyn reached the grand stone steps of the entrance. She did not knock. She did not wait to be announced. She placed her hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door, the red-sealed envelope gripped tightly in her left hand, and pushed it open. The winter wind followed her inside. The heavy double doors of the ballroom were solid oak built to withstand centuries of storms, but when Evelyn pushed them open, they yielded with a deep, echoing groan. The winter wind did not just enter the room, it invaded. It swept across the polished marble floor, cutting through the stifling heat of the packed crowd. The flames of the wall sconces flickered violently, casting long, frantic shadows. The dying white orchids shuddered. The string quartet, caught off guard by the sudden blast of freezing air, faltered. The cellist missed a beat. The violinist's bow slipped, and within 3 seconds, the lively Viennese waltz collapsed into a discordant, dying scrape of strings. Total silence fell over the Sterling estate ballroom. Evelyn stepped over the threshold. She did not look like the woman who had been banished to the snow a week prior. She did not look like a ghost, nor a victim, nor a heartbroken wife seeking closure. Framed by the massive doorway, wearing her tailored black velvet coat with its sharp collar standing high against the cold, she looked like an executioner who had come to collect. Her posture was a masterclass in controlled dominance. Her spine was locked perfectly straight. Her wide-set hazel eyes, devoid of any warmth or hesitation, swept across the 400 crystal drops of the chandelier and then down to the crowd. The county elite, the judges, the shipping magnates, the wealthy widows who had whispered about her spectacular fall from grace parted instinctively. They moved back like water, making way for a ship, leaving a wide, empty path down the center of the ballroom. They had expected to see a broken, weeping woman. Instead, they found themselves holding their breath, intimidated by the sheer devastating calm radiating from her. At the base of the grand staircase, Arthur Sterling froze. The crystal glass of whiskey in his right hand paused halfway to his mouth. In his left hand, his thumb slipped on the mechanism of his gold pocket watch. Click. The watch snapped shut, the sound echoing loudly in the breathless room. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the invincible Duke slipped, revealing the terrified, confused man underneath. He stared at Evelyn's immaculate coat, at the firm line of her jaw, trying to reconcile this formidable woman with the quiet, faded wife he had discarded. Beside him, Vivienne Vance was rapidly losing her grip on reality. Her pale green eyes widened in horror. She clutched the stem of her champagne flute, her knuckles turning bone white. The icy draft from the open doors hit her thin white silk gown, raising goosebumps on her skin, but the cold she felt was entirely internal. She touched Evelyn's grandmother's pearls at her throat, a defensive, frantic gesture. Evelyn began to walk. Her leather boots struck the marble floor with measured, deliberate precision. Click, click, click. She did not rush. She did not look at the whispers erupting in her wake. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on Arthur and Vivienne. Arthur finally recovered enough of his arrogance to move. He handed his whiskey to a passing, terrified waiter and stepped into the center of the aisle to block her path. He drew himself up to his full height, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate her, a tactic that had worked for 20 years. "Evelyn," Arthur hissed, keeping his voice dangerously low, though the room was so quiet every syllable carried. "Have you lost your mind? You are trespassing. Leave this house immediately before I have Hughes physically drag you out and hand you to the local magistrate." Evelyn did not stop walking until she was exactly 2 feet away from him. She did not flinch. She did not drop her gaze. She simply looked at him, her hazel eyes flat and unbothered. "If you touch me, Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and entirely conversational, "you will lose your hands." Arthur blinked, momentarily stunned by the utter lack of fear in her voice. He reached out to grab her arm, a reflex born of entitlement. Evelyn shifted her gaze to his approaching hand. She didn't move away. She didn't block it. She just stared at his fingers with such cold, clinical disgust that Arthur's hand stopped in midair, hesitating before he slowly lowered it back to his side. He had never been looked at like that by anyone in his life. It was the look one gives a stray, diseased animal. Seeing Arthur falter, Vivienne felt a surge of desperate, venomous panic. She could feel the eyes of Lady Harrington and the rest of the elite burning into her back. She needed to assert her dominance. She needed to prove she was the Duchess, the heiress, the winner. Vivienne stepped out from behind Arthur, forcing a loud, brittle laugh that shattered the quiet. "Arthur, darling, who let the beggar in." Vivienne mocked, her American accent dialed up to project across the ballroom. She waved her champagne flute toward Evelyn's black coat. "Evelyn, are you lost? The servants' entrance is around the back of the kitchens. Or did you spend your meager allowance already and come crawling back to beg for winter coal, because I assure you my charity has its limits?" A few gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a crude, vulgar attack, lacking the refined subtlety of high society. Evelyn turned her head slowly. She looked at Vivienne. She looked at the sweat gleaming under the heavy powder on Vivienne's forehead. She looked at the white silk gown that was completely unsuited for the climate. And finally, she looked at the pearl necklace resting against Vivienne's collarbone. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket with her left hand. Her right hand remained deep in her other pocket, her fingers resting lightly against the rusted iron gate key, feeling the healed red mark on her palm. "I did not come to beg for coal, Miss Vance," Evelyn said. She did not raise her voice, but the acoustic perfection of the ballroom carried her words to the farthest corners of the room. "And I see you are keeping my grandmother's pearls warm. Enjoy them for the next 5 minutes. They are the only things of value you currently possess." Vivienne's forced smile collapsed. "Excuse me, I am an heiress to..." "You are a fraud." Evelyn interrupted cleanly, her voice cutting through Vivian's lie like a scalpel. You are deeply in debt to 3 separate creditors in Manhattan, none of whom care about your fictional trust fund. You forged your financial letters at a cheap printing mill in New York, and you are currently hiding in my county wearing my family's jewelry, hoping this foolish man will pay off your debts before you are arrested. The entire ballroom inhaled at the exact same moment. Vivienne opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face turned the color of ash. Arthur whipped his head around to stare at Vivienne, his steely blue eyes wide with shock. Evelyn, what lies are you spouting? Arthur demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Vivienne's capital is clearing on Monday. Vivienne has no capital, Arthur, Evelyn said, looking back at him with absolute chilling pity. She withdrew her left hand from her velvet coat pocket. And as of yesterday morning, neither do you. She held up the thick envelope sealed with blood-red wax. The envelope in Evelyn's hand seemed to absorb the fractured light of the crystal chandelier, the blood-red wax seal glowing like a warning in the dead center of the ballroom. A young waiter holding a silver tray meant for empty champagne flutes was standing frozen a few feet away. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto him. She did not speak, but the sheer authority in her posture commanded him to move. Trembling, the boy stepped forward, holding the silver tray out like an offering. Evelyn placed the heavy envelope onto the silver tray. The dull, heavy thud of the paper hitting the metal echoed loudly in the breathless room. Arthur, she is lying! Vivienne shrieked, the shrill, frantic pitch of her voice shattering the tension. She grabbed Arthur's tuxedo sleeve, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the black fabric. This is a pathetic, jealous stunt. Tell Hughes to throw her out. I have a trust fund. I am an heiress. Evelyn did not even look at Vivienne. She kept her hazel eyes fixed on Arthur. Telegram from New York, received this morning. Evelyn recited, her voice as calm and rhythmic as a ticking clock. Creditors aware of fraud. If payment not received by Friday will contact your husband and press charges. You have no trust fund, Vivienne. Time is up. Vivienne's mouth snapped shut. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving only the harsh, unnatural streaks of her contouring powder. She stumbled back a step, her hand releasing Arthur's sleeve. The pearls around her neck, Evelyn's grandmother's pearls, clattered softly against each other as her chest heaved in panicked, shallow gasps. A low collective murmur swept through the county elite. Lady Harrington, standing near the dying white orchids, took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her hawk-like eyes gleaming with the vicious thrill of high society ruin. In less than 60 seconds, Vivienne Vance had gone from the glittering new duchess to a destitute, desperate fraud. Social death, absolute and irreversible, had just occurred before their very eyes. Arthur stared at Vivienne. His steely blue eyes, usually so full of arrogant certainty, widened as he saw the unmistakable truth written across her terrified face. She was not a savior, she was a parasite who had attached herself to a sinking ship. Disgust twisted Arthur's features. He forcefully brushed the sleeve of his tuxedo where she had touched him, stepping away from her as if she were contagious. You forged your letters. Arthur breathed out, the realization crashing over him. You brought nothing. You are nothing. Vivienne opened her mouth, tears of raw panic finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her perfect makeup. But before she could formulate a single excuse, Arthur turned his back on her entirely. He squared his broad shoulders, desperately trying to salvage the remnants of his dignity in front of the 400 guests watching his public humiliation. Fine, Arthur snapped, looking back at Evelyn. His jaw was locked, his pride violently fighting against the reality of the situation. She is a fraud. I will have the marriage annulled by morning, but that changes nothing about my standing, Evelyn. You may have uncovered her pathetic little scheme, but the Sterling estate stands on its own. My creditors, Winter Holdings, are restructuring the estate's debt as we speak. I am still the Duke. and this is still my house. Evelyn looked at him. She did not smile, but a shadow of something profoundly cold settled over her face. Winter Holdings is not restructuring your debt, Arthur, Evelyn said quietly. Winter Holdings is calling it in. Arthur scoffed a short, harsh sound of disbelief. You know nothing of my banking arrangements. You are a discarded wife with a single suitcase. Do not presume to understand the workings of a multi-million-pound syndicate. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her black velvet coat. Her right hand brushed against the rusted iron gate key, feeling the healed red mark on her palm, drawing strength from the memory of the freezing snow. Then she reached out and picked up the red-sealed envelope from the waiter's silver tray. With a swift, elegant motion, she broke the wax seal. The sharp crack of the wax breaking sounded like a gunshot. She unfolded the thick legal document and held it out. I know every comma of your banking arrangements, Arthur, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a register of such absolute, undeniable power that several guests physically leaned back. Because I am Winter Holdings. Arthur froze. He stared at her, uncomprehending. What did you say? Winter Holdings is a shell corporation. Evelyn explained, her tone clinical, as if explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. Named for the season in which you decided to throw me out of my own home. My grandfather established a blind trust for me 20 years ago in London. While you were buying custom tweeds, gambling on bad harvests, and burying this estate in mortgages, my grandfather's money was compounding. Safely, quietly, far away from your incompetence. Arthur's face went completely slack. He took a staggering step forward, snatching the document from her hand. His eyes darted frantically across the legal text. He saw the official stamps of the London Financial Syndicate. He saw the listed mortgages, the agricultural liens, the personal credit lines, every single debt he owed in the world, bundled together and legally transferred. And at the bottom of the page, signed as the sole beneficiary and primary lien holder of Winter Holdings, was the signature Evelyn Sterling. No. Arthur whispered the paper, shaking violently in his hands. No, this is impossible. You did not have the capital. You wore faded wool. You canceled the heating oil. I canceled the heating oil to pay your staff. Evelyn corrected sharply, refusing to let him rewrite history. I wore faded wool because I refused to bleed my ancestry to fund your vanity. You mistook my discipline for poverty, Arthur. You mistook my silence for weakness. The document slipped from Arthur's trembling fingers, fluttering to the marble floor and landing next to the dying petals of a fallen white orchid. The grace period on the primary mortgage expired at sundown today. Evelyn stated, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. She looked at the man who had humiliated her, stripped him of his illusions, and finally delivered the killing blow. The foreclosure is absolute. You do not own the land. You do not own the manor. You do not even own the glass of whiskey you are drinking. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, her hazel eyes locking onto his terrified blue ones. You are currently trespassing on my property, Arthur. The silence that followed Evelyn's declaration was not empty. It was thick, suffocating, and heavy, with the sudden, violent realignment of power. In the ruthless, gilded world of the county elite, loyalty was a currency strictly pegged to wealth. As the red-sealed foreclosure document lay on the marble floor, the social stock of Arthur Sterling crashed to absolute zero. Arthur looked around the ballroom, his steely blue eyes searching the crowd for an ally, for someone to step forward and intervene. He looked at the local magistrate who had just been laughing at his jokes. The magistrate examined the ceiling. He looked at the shipping magnates he hunted with on the weekends. They physically took a collective step backward, pulling their wives with them, widening the empty circle around Arthur and Vivian. They were treating him like he was contagious. Poverty to this crowd was the only unforgivable disease. Lady Harrington stepped forward slightly, but not to help. She set her half-empty champagne flute onto a passing waiter's tray with a sharp, dismissive clink. She looked at Arthur, then at Vivian, and finally at Evelyn. Lady Harrington gave Evelyn a slow, shallow nod of profound respect, the kind of greeting reserved only for apex predators. Then she turned her back on Arthur entirely. Arthur's chest heaved. The bespoke black tuxedo suddenly looked too large for him, as if his physical stature was shrinking in real time. "You cannot do this." Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and rising terror. "I am the Duke of Stirling. This is my ancestral seat. A piece of paper from a London bank does not erase bloodlines, Evelyn. We can go to the library. We can manage this privately as a family." "We are not family, Arthur," Evelyn replied smoothly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her absolute calm was far more terrifying than any scream. "And your title is a ghost. A duke without land is just a man in a rented tuxedo. You chose to sever our ties at the estate gates last week. I am simply enforcing the boundary you drew." Beside him, Vivienne Vance began to sob. It was not a delicate, tragic weeping. It was the ugly, hyperventilating panic of a cornered animal. The reality of her situation had finally crushed her. Without Arthur's protection, without the illusion of the Stirling wealth, she was a broke, fraudulent socialite with Manhattan creditors breathing down her neck. She lunged forward, her white silk gown sweeping across the marble, and stopped just short of Evelyn. "Evelyn, please." Vivienne begged, her American accent cracking violently. Her perfectly pinned blonde curls were unraveling, falling in erratic strands across her tear-streaked face. "Please, you don't understand. The men in New York, they will ruin me. They will put me in prison. I only forged the letters because I had nothing left. If you throw me out tonight, I have nowhere to go. Have mercy." Evelyn looked down at the trembling woman. She felt no triumph, only a cold, clinical disgust. "Mercy," Evelyn repeated softly, testing the word on her tongue. "When I stood at the gates in the snow, stripped of my home, and 20 years of my life, you stood at the window and laughed. You ordered my belongings left in the freezing gravel. You did not offer mercy, Miss Vance. You offered cruelty." Evelyn extended her left hand, her palm open. "My grandmother's pearls," Evelyn commanded. "Take them off." Vivienne gasped, her hands flying to her throat to protect the jewelry. "No, please, I need—" "Unclasp them," Evelyn said, her tone dropping into a deadly, unyielding register. "Or I will have the magistrate standing behind you arrest you for grand larceny right now." Whimpering, Vivienne's shaking fingers fumbled with the delicate silver clasp at the back of her neck. It took her 3 humiliating attempts before the clasp gave way. She lowered her head, sobbing openly now, and placed the heavy string of pearls into Evelyn's open hand. Evelyn closed her fingers around the cool, familiar gems. She slipped them into the deep pocket of her velvet coat, letting them rest beside the rusted iron gate key. Arthur watched this exchange, his aristocratic pride finally shattering into panic. "Evelyn, be reasonable." Arthur pleaded, the arrogant rumble of his voice completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, reedy whine. "There is a winter storm outside. The temperature is below freezing. You cannot throw us into the night. It is inhumane. Allow us to stay until morning. Allow us to pack our things." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying the man she had once spent a lifetime trying to protect. "You gave me 10 minutes to pack a single suitcase," Evelyn stated flatly, "and I did not beg. I suggest you find whatever scrap of dignity you have left and walk out that door before I have you physically removed." She turned her gaze past Arthur's shoulder, looking toward the shadows near the kitchen corridor. "Hughes," Evelyn called out. The estate manager stepped into the light. He did not hesitate. He did not look at Arthur for permission. He walked straight down the aisle, created by the elite guest holding his leather ledger tight against his chest, and stopped 2 paces from Evelyn. He bowed deeply. "Madame Purr," Hughes said, his voice ringing with absolute, unflinching loyalty. He had watched her keep this estate alive for a decade. He knew exactly who the true master of the house was. "Are the remaining staff assembled?" Evelyn asked. "They are, madam, waiting upon your orders." "Good," Evelyn said. She gestured toward the grand oak doors, which were still wide open, letting the freezing winter wind howl into the ballroom. "Arthur and Miss Vance are leaving. They are not to return to the upper floors. They are not to pack. Escort them off my property immediately." "You have no right!" Arthur roared, a sudden desperate surge of fury overtaking him. He lunged toward Evelyn, his hands reaching out to grab her velvet coat. He never made it. Hughes, moving with surprising speed for an older man, stepped squarely into Arthur's path, shoving a heavy hand against the Duke's chest. Two footmen, having heard the commotion, immediately rushed from the hallway and grabbed Arthur by both arms, locking him in place. Arthur struggled wildly, his polished veneer entirely destroyed. His gold pocket watch slipped from his waistcoat, dangling pathetically from its chain, swinging like a pendulum. "Unhand me, I am the Duke of Stirling!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking, echoing off the high ceiling. "This is my house." "This is Winter Holdings," Hughes said, coldly, giving Arthur another firm shove toward the entrance. "And you are trespassing. Keep moving, sir." Vivienne, realizing that the fight was entirely lost, let out a wretched, high-pitched wail. She grabbed the skirts of her white silk gown, stumbling backward toward the open doors, terrified that the footman would grab her next. Evelyn stood motionless under the crystal chandelier. She did not raise her voice. She did not smile. She simply watched with cold, elegant satisfaction as the footman dragged her ex-husband backward across the marble floor. The crowd of elites watched in absolute silence, parting further to let the disgraced couple pass. The scent of the dying white orchids suddenly felt incredibly fitting. The illusion of Arthur Stirling had withered, died, and was now being swept out into the trash. They reached the threshold of the grand oak doors. The winter wind whipped around them, biting violently into Arthur's tuxedo and Vivienne's thin silk gown. "Evelyn!" Arthur screamed one last time from the doorway, his voice frantic, echoing into the freezing night. Evelyn did not answer. She simply turned her back on him. The heavy oak doors of the Stirling estate slammed shut with a final echoing thud, cutting off the freezing winter wind. Inside the ballroom, the silence was absolute. 400 of the county's elite stood motionless under the crystal chandelier, their eyes fixed on the woman standing in the center of the room. Evelyn Stirling did not gloat. She did not raise a glass in victory. She simply stood in her tailored black velvet coat, the undisputed, undeniable master of the house. She turned her gaze slowly across the crowd. Lady Harrington lowered her head in a deep, respectful nod. The local magistrate who had been laughing with Arthur 10 minutes ago suddenly found the floor marble endlessly fascinating. They all understood the new reality. The Duke was gone. The Queen had returned. Evelyn looked at Hughes, the estate manager who was standing tall by the doorway. "See to it that the guests are offered fresh champagne." Hughes, wait. Evelyn said, her voice smooth and unbothered. "And inform the caterers that their invoices will be settled in full by tomorrow morning, drawn from the Winter Holdings primary account." Hughes bowed, a genuine relieved smile touching his weary face for the first time in months. "At once, madam." Evelyn turned and walked toward the grand entrance hall. She did not stay to accept their forced apologies or their sudden sycophantic loyalty. She had one final piece of business to attend to. She pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped back out into the freezing night. The snow had begun to fall again, soft, silent flakes drifting down through the bitter air. The temperature had plunged further, freezing the world into a brittle, white silence. Evelyn walked down the grand stone steps, her leather boots crunching against the ice. She pulled the velvet collar of her coat a little tighter against the wind, but she did not feel the cold. The fire of her own quiet survival kept her perfectly warm. She walked down the long, sweeping driveway, following the drag marks in the snow where the footman had hauled Arthur and Vivienne away. 50 yards ahead, the massive wrought iron gates of the estate loomed in the darkness. Standing on the wrong side of the iron bars, shivering violently in the brutal winter storm, were Arthur and Vivienne. Vivienne was huddled against the stone pillar of the gate, her arms wrapped desperately around her chest. Her ice-white silk gown, which had looked so glamorous under the ballroom chandelier, was now a pathetic, freezing rag clinging to her shivering frame. Her bleached curls were plastered to her wet face, and the heavy makeup was running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She was crying a broken, whimpering sound that was swallowed by the wind. Arthur stood gripping the iron bars. His bespoke black tuxedo offered no protection against the biting cold. His hair was disheveled, and the gold chain of his pocket watch hung broken and empty from his waistcoat. When he heard the crunch of Evelyn's boots, his head snapped up. Evelyn. Arthur gasped, his voice raspy and shaking. He pressed his face against the frozen iron bars, looking at her as she stopped just a few feet away on the inside of the gates. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the man who had ordered her out of her own home a week ago. She remembered the sheer arrogance in his steely blue eyes as he drank his whiskey and told her she was a liability. Now, those same eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic with despair. Arthur's knees gave out. He dropped into the snow on the other side of the gate, his hands still clinging desperately to the iron bars. The great Duke of Stirling kneeling in the freezing dirt. "Evelyn, please." Arthur begged, his voice breaking into a wretched sob. "I was blind. I was a fool. I let my pride and the pressure of the debts twist my mind. She manipulated me, Evelyn. She lied to me. I never wanted to hurt you. You are my wife. You are the only one who ever truly cared for this estate, for me. Please open the gate. Give me a chance to make it right. I will do anything." Evelyn stood perfectly still, letting his pathetic, desperate words wash over her and fade into the winter wind. "You did not love me, Arthur," Evelyn said quietly, her voice carrying the cold, devastating weight of absolute truth. "You loved what I maintained. You loved the warmth of the fires I paid for. You loved the prestige of the house I kept from collapsing. And the moment you thought someone else could buy you an easier life, you threw me into the snow without a second thought." Arthur sobbed, his forehead resting against the freezing iron. "I'm sorry, God, Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I have nothing left." "I know," Evelyn said, "because I bought it all." She reached into the deep pocket of her black velvet coat. Her fingers bypassed the string of pearls she had taken from Vivienne and closed around the heavy, rusted iron key. She pulled the key out and held it up. Arthur stared at the rusted metal. He recognized it. It was the master key. He had ignored the key she had carried when she walked away. Evelyn stepped forward. She did not reach out to touch him. She did not offer a hand of forgiveness. She simply slid the rusted key into the heavy iron padlock that secured the main gates. "You told me that this estate requires real capital, Arthur," Evelyn said, looking down at him with eyes that held no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no mercy. "You were right." She turned the key. The heavy metallic clack of the lock engaging echoed sharply in the quiet, snowy night. The gates were officially sealed. "Goodbye, Arthur," Evelyn said softly. She pulled the key from the lock, slipped it back into her pocket, and turned around. "Evelyn." Arthur screamed, shaking the locked iron gates with all his remaining strength. "Evelyn, don't leave me out here. Please, Evelyn." She did not stop. She did not hesitate. Her spine was straight, her shoulders squared beneath the immaculate black velvet coat. She walked back up the pristine, snow-covered driveway, moving with the slow, elegant grace of a woman who had fought through hell and emerged completely untouchable. Behind her, Arthur's screams dissolved into broken, hysterical weeping, mixing with Vivienne's wretched sobs in the freezing dark. Ahead of her, the Stirling estate glowed. The windows of the east wing were ablaze with golden light. The doors were open, waiting to welcome its true master home. Evelyn walked up the stone steps, crossed the threshold, and the grand oak doors closed behind her, leaving the cold and the men who trade loyalty for illusions locked outside forever.